Right. Well,
and
good afternoon,
over.
everybody.
What more can
Come on
I
in. I see those numbers are rising as people are jumping over. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We are super excited to welcome you. Just a few Zoom room etiquette things for the day. We're going to be using our chat for Q&A. So if you have thoughts or questions as we go through, you can go ahead and put those in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. And then, of course, we'll have some time at the end if you want to raise your hand and ask a question. We are recording the session and it will get added to the whole use YouTube and also emailed out to everyone who registered. So if you have to jump off or you want to revisit it at any time, you'll have that in your inbox. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off today to Jessica Cole, who's the Director of Work Life, who's going to get us started. Thanks so much, Jessica.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, all. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to Professor Johnson. Today, as the Boeing Company Endowed Professor in Business Management at the University of Washington's Foster School of Business, Professor Johnson brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. With a PhD from Michigan State University and over 16 years in the nonprofit world, his research focuses on enhancing collaboration, understanding social identities, and navigating emotions in the workplace. Professor Johnson has contributed to leading journals and is a member of prestigious organizations like the Academy of Management and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and has won numerous honors and awards, including the Dean's Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Johnson. Thank you so much, Professor Johnson, for being here to teach us today.
Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for attending this particular session. I'm particularly interested in this session, partly because I do research in this area, but also because there is so much nonsense out there in the world about personality. And so what I want to share with you today is the best research that we have in personality and how this applies to each of us and how we can adjust our personalities and get along with other people better who might have different personalities than ourselves. I am an organizational psychologist and I actually don't know much about business. So I'm in the Foster School of Business, but I know a lot more about psychology than I know about business. And psychologists for a long time have been trying to figure out why people behave the way they do. And certainly much of our behavior is driven by the situations that we find ourselves in, but there's also a lot that comes from within us. So for example, human nature is something that we share with everybody around the world. It's universal, it's biological, it's part of the human genome. And anthropologists have found out hundreds of what they call universals of behaviors that we see no matter where you go in the world. Things like baby talk. You know, every culture in the world has a particular way of talking to babies that's different than the way we speak to adults. A belief in the supernatural. Now, certainly that's fading from many cultures and parts of the world, you know, in modern times, but all cultures sort of based on this idea of a belief in the supernatural. The use of rhythmic movement or dance, sometimes for ritual purposes, sometimes just for entertainment. The use of narratives or storytelling. We also for entertainment, but for, you know, for teaching, for instruction. And there's something ancient really in our genome about how stories resonate with us. And then, you know, here's a fifth one, wariness around snakes. We find this everywhere in the world. And in fact, some geneticists say that there's a significant part of the human genome that was actually developed because of our interaction with snakes over the millennia. But that's what we have in common with everybody. We're not going to talk any more about that. What is in between, wow, okay, my slides are, animation has gone crazy, is culture. Culture is specific to groups and it's learned. It's the part of who we are that we get from where we grew up. And many psychologists refer to this as like an operating system for the mind, but it's completely learned. Nothing with culture is genetic. On the other hand, personality has a genetic element. And in fact, the best research that we have these days suggests that around 50% of our personalities are inherited through our genes from our parents. And about 50% is determined by the environment in which we have grown. And this is specific to individuals. And so within cultures, we see a lot of variance in personality, although they're not perfectly distinct. And there are some cultures where you find some personality characteristics to be more dominant than in others. So for example, in the United States, we tend to have more of a emphasis on extroversion. And so people grow up a little more extroverted than they might say in Sweden or in Japan, where introversion would be a little more acceptable, or at least more the norm. So even though these aren't perfectly clear, we're going to restrict our thinking to your own personality and how that differentiates you from other people. And we have to, because, I said there's a lot of nonsense out there about personality, and there are two particular myths that I'd like to dispel at the very beginning. And the first is that your personality is fixed. The father of psychology, father of American psychology, William James, said, "It is well for the world that in most of us, by the age of 30, the character is set like plaster and will never soften again." Well, I'm sorry, William James, but more recent research in neuroscience suggests that our personalities can be molded even in adulthood, that our brains are much more plastic than we used to think. And with concerted effort, we can actually change elements of our personality. The second myth is that your personality determines your behavior. And many people like to use personality, or some people like to use personality as an excuse. I can't help it. I act this way. That's just who I am because of my personality. But research by our own Yuichi Shoda, emeritus professor in the psychology department at the University of Washington, suggests that personality doesn't determine our behavior, but rather determines a range of behavior. Back over 100 years ago, the writer and philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, "There are times when I'm so unlike myself that I might be taken for someone else of an entirely opposite character." And I would bet that if you think back to your own behavior, there are times when you act completely differently depending on the situation that you're in. And that's true for most people. And so the truths about personality are your personality is not completely fixed. It is harder to change your personality as an adult than it is as a child, but it is possible with conscious, concerted effort. And your personality determines the range of your behavior. If you're an extreme introvert, you're likely never going to act extremely extroverted, but you can act more extroverted than your biogenic personality might suggest. Okay, so I see in the chat that it's gotten quiet. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
So I
Sound
see
right.
some nods. Okay, yeah, I've got some construction going on outside that might have, when one of those machines came on, it might have softened everything. Okay, great. So let's talk about how you measure personality. Have you seen this before? Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, taken by over 2 million people in the world every year, the most popular measure of personality in organizations. And I have to give you bad news if you're a big fan of the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, is that its psychometric characteristics are not very good. In particular, its reliability. And so if you take the MBTI more than once, then many people turn up with completely different scores another time. So it's not measuring something stable about people. It's a little bit better in terms of validity, but it doesn't predict much for a business professor in terms of the kinds of outcomes we care about at work. So Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, can't recommend it. They have really cool marketing materials, very glossy. And so lots of people like it because it looks really official, but take it from me, not your best personality test. Maybe you've seen this one or taken this one before, the DISC profile. The DISC measures sort of kind of your dominant and secondary characteristics and puts you into kind of one of these 4 quadrants. If you've taken the DISC and you liked it, I'm sorry to say also this one has relatively poor psychometric characteristics. Often people will like one of these because they felt like it described them very well. And so maybe it got lucky in describing you, but it's not one that we recommend. Third one you might have seen is the colors test, and there are a variety of different colors tests that kind of puts you into one of these quadrants. That's kind of a combination of personality characteristics. My son, who works for a local tech company, which shall not be named, contacted me once and said, "Dad, they're doing a personality test for all of us." He said, "I don't think it's good, but can you give me your professional advice on it?" And he sent it over, and it was a colors test. And I looked on the back of it, of their electronic brochure, and it had a recommendation from a guy that I was in grad school with, who actually never finished his PhD, but instead faked his diploma, and was arrested for fraud at the university where he was working at the time. And he was one of the ones who was promoting this as a good tool. Now, certainly, who promotes a tool doesn't say whether it's good or bad or not. But again, the psychometric characteristics of these colors tests are really not very good. A couple of my students have said that they've taken colors tests, and then their management says, gives them little signs to put on their desks. So like, I'm a green, and therefore everybody who comes up to you sees that you're a green and interacts with you according to that. A big problem with these kinds of tests is that they suggest that all the 8 billion people in the world can fit into a quadrant or into one of the 16 boxes of the Myers-Briggs type inventory, when really personality is a continuum. We can range from one end of a pole on a personality trait all the way to the other end of a pole. And so we need something that is better able to capture that kind of continuum of personality traits. And that's where we have the big five. And I know that for those of you who registered, you probably received an email that gave you a link to a free Big Five test. And this is the test that is most commonly used by the vast majority of both clinical and organizational psychologists in terms of 5 different personality traits. There are many different versions of the test, and many of them are free, like the one you may have taken. But they all get at these same 5 characteristics, the characteristics of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience, and neuroticism. And this is the best validated, has the best psychometric characteristics of any of the tests we know. It's not perfect, and we'll freely admit that, but it is the best tool that we currently have. And it measures, differentiates about 75% of personality characteristics across individuals. So let's talk about that and what this means for you. If you've taken the test before, great. If not, we're putting links into the chat where you would be able to take that particular test. And so the suggestion here from the Big Five or 5-factor model of personality is that everybody ranges from low to high on each of these 5 traits. And you can remember the traits. The mnemonic is OCEAN, and you can see they're in ocean order: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. If you're afraid of the big ocean, then you can rearrange them to spell canoe, by the way, if you like that a little more. But an easy way to kind of remember what they are. Let's talk about each of these in turn and what they mean for you. So first, the O in ocean: openness to experience. It captures the extent to which people are curious, imaginative, creative, complex, refined, and sophisticated. Really, people who are high on openness to experience, we often think of as people with their head in the clouds. They're always thinking about different ideas. They're willing to explore new things. They're willing to try new things. Whereas people who are low in openness to experience, we often think of these people as having their feet on the ground. They like the tried and true. Their motto is, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Whereas someone who's high in openness to experience, their motto might be, if it isn't broke, break it, and let's see if we can make it better. And we need both kinds of people, but with openness to experience, the people who are highly open tend to prioritize creativity, and they will provide value in roles that require high levels of innovation. So as you think about your work at UW, in your hiring process, if you have a chance to select people and you need creative people, this is one trait you really want to pay attention to. If you're in a scientific role at UW, then likely you are high in openness to experience. So people tend to be drawn to scientific and artistic fields if they're high in openness to experience, whereas people lower in openness to experience tend to be drawn to more conventional fields. I love accountants. We have a whole accounting department at the Foster School, which is amazing. I want my accountant to be someone who's low on openness to experience, not someone who's high on openness to experience. I don't want them to get creative with my accounting, and we've seen the problems that can happen when people do get creative. So someone who's low on openness to experience would like something that's a little more conventional. So here's from a very old psychological test that, to be honest, really has no reliability and validity to it. But I want to use this for an illustration. As you look at this ink blot from Rorschach's ink blot test, what do you see in this? And you can feel free to kind of type something in the chat if you see any particular figures in this ink blot. These crabs, lungs, seahorse, pelvis, yeah. Oh, we must have a number of people from healthcare in here. Eiffel Tower, Madagascar, wow, octopi, pliers, yeah. All right, so for all you people that are typing in the chat now, you are likely high on openness to experience, where you can see lots of things in this figure. We may have some people in the room today, though, who see just a bunch of ink on the screen. And if that's true, then that's likely someone who's low on openness to experience. And so this is just one way you can kind of think about, can you come up with lots of different ways of thinking about something? If so, you're likely someone who's very high on openness to experience. This is the highest of all of my traits, by the way, on the 5-factor model. Wow, we're getting even more suggestions. Cool. That's very cool. So from the lab of Sam Gosling at the University of Texas at Austin, hundreds of thousands, now millions of people have taken the Big Five, one or at least one version of Big Five or 5-factor model inventory across the United States. And so Gosling's lab now has been able to map these at the county level within the United States. And so this is the geographic distribution of openness at the county level. And you can see that the coasts and the West in particular, very high on openness to experience. The darker orange means higher levels. For those of us in the Pacific Northwest, we have a very high level of openness to experience in Western Washington, as well as throughout the West Coast. You see some of this also on the East Coast and a little bit in the South. Whereas the heartland of the country tends to be more conventional in terms of openness to experience, where it's more people with their feet on the ground rather than with their heads in the clouds, like we might have on the coasts. So maybe you can find the county where you grew up if you didn't grow up in the area, and see whether this you think this really kind of reflects the area where you were raised. I was raised in West Michigan, and it's a very low on openness to experience, and I feel much more at home in Seattle now than I do in West Michigan. Question, what about Hawaii? Unfortunately, we don't have enough data for Hawaii or Alaska to be able to plot those. So I apologize for that, Lisa. Maybe I'll call up Sam Gosling at Texas and say, get on that. Let's get some Hawaii and Alaska things in here. The C in the ocean model of the 5-factor model of personality is conscientiousness. And this captures the extent to which you tend to be dependable, organized, reliable, ambitious, hardworking, and you tend to persevere more if you're high in conscientiousness. There's some research that suggests that you can determine with a pretty good level of accuracy someone's level of conscientiousness by looking at their workspace. And some of this research has been done with student dorm rooms. And so if your workspace looks like this, well, maybe you're on the lower end of conscientiousness. However, if you're constantly planning things and very well organized and your workspace is very neat, then you're likely someone who's higher in conscientiousness. And people who are high in conscientiousness prioritize accomplishment striving. What this means is that if you're high in conscientiousness, you like to achieve things, and you know, like to have kind of those achievements under your belt. We find at the Foster School that the students who enroll in our graduate programs tend to be overrepresented in high conscientiousness. And in fact, you know, these people, because they are accomplishment striving, then they have a strong desire to accomplish task-related goals. So they want to see that their goals are achieved. And this has the biggest influence on performance across all types of jobs. And there have been meta-analyses on this that find that even with jobs where you would think conscientiousness might not matter so much, it does. And people who are higher in conscientiousness tend to be better performers at their job than people who are lower in conscientiousness. Now, I often have students who say, well, then can we just give our applicants a test and have them you know, have them turn in a five-factor model test to us? And unfortunately, it's really easy to fake conscientiousness in particular. And so you may, if you took the test, you may have seen, well, if I were doing this for a job interview, I would want to appear higher in conscientiousness than maybe I naturally am. But in general, people who are high in conscientiousness are better performers than people who are low. And conscientiousness is associated with organizational deviance, such that people who are high in conscientiousness are less likely to engage in behaviors like lying or stealing or verbally abusing or gossiping about coworkers. And so conscientiousness is, you know, unlike many of the other traits, there's not a lot of really good things about being low in conscientiousness as it comes to work. Being high in conscientiousness is generally associated with positive things at work. And by the way, as I say this, unlike some of the other personality assessments that say, I'm okay, you're okay, we're just different, the five-factor model suggests that there are parts of our personalities that can be very challenging. And so those are the things that we might want to work on. See a question in the chat about, is there a dark triad test? Yes, in fact, now we're calling it the dark tetrad, as sadism has been added to the dark triad, but maybe we can save that for question and answer at the end. Here's the geographic distribution of personality from Gosling's lab. And you can see that for conscientiousness, it really centralizes in the South. So this is, you know, kind of the Bible Belt, people who feel a sense of doing their duty. And so we see a lot there, whereas in the rest of the country, it's much more scattered at the county level. So this is not a heartland versus coast or an urban versus rural trait. It really does distribute much more than the other five. The E in the ocean mnemonic of the big five is extroversion. And this is the one that is consistent with the Myers-Briggs type inventory. And in fact, there tend to be pretty good correlations between measures of the big five and the extroversion as measured in the Myers-Briggs type inventory, much better than any of the other scales that are in the MBTI. And so extroversion captures the extent to which you tend to be talkative and sociable, that you might be assertive, bold, and even dominant. And as such, people who are high in extroversion tend to prioritize status striving. So people who are highly extroverted like to be seen as people of high status. And they might often sort of dominate a group discussion, partly because they tend to like talking more than people who are more introverted, but also because they like to kind of be seen as someone who is high status within the group. They have a strong desire to obtain power and influence within a social structure. And some psychologists have said at a cultural level that we really reward extroverts more than introverts in the United States in particular. And some research has found some good things, like better sales and managerial performance, although some fairly recent research by Adam Grant at the Wharton School finds that people who are in the middle, not extroverted or introverted, but ambiverts, somewhere in the middle, tend to be a little better at sales. but extroverts tend to emerge more as leaders. And I'll show you a particular finding on that at the end. One of the really interesting things about extroversion is its association with the emotions that people tend to experience on a day-to-day basis. And so extroverts tend to be high in positive affectivity. This chart on the screen is what we refer to as the circumplex of emotions, where the horizontal axis is the pleasantness of an emotion. So you can see things like glad and pleased that are on the right side of this chart are associated with kind of better things than on the left side, frustrated, distressed, miserable. The vertical axis on this chart is the intensity, or actually more accurately, the arousal or activation of the emotion. So things at the top, like being alarmed or astonished, are much more emotionally arousing than things like being droopy and tired at the bottom. And so extroverts tend to spend most of their time in this upper right quadrant. So extroverts tend to be happier on average than people who are introverted. Now, introverted people aren't like miserable, sad, depressed, but rather more in the middle, having a wider range of emotions. This is the lowest score for me. I am an extreme introvert, and so sometimes when I'm around extroverts, I just want to slap that smile off their face and like, come on, be real, because they're so happy all the time. And so if you're an introvert and someone comes up to you and says, smile, then that's probably an extrovert telling you that. And you might feel like, I don't really feel like smiling right now because you're not living in that same space as they are. Here's the geographic distribution of extroversion. And so what we find here is, again, there's some clustering of this in the South, but a lot in the Midwest. And so people in the upper Midwest tend to be very extroverted. So, I mentioned the openness didn't really fit with me. The extroversion doesn't really fit with me in West Michigan, whereas it fits much better being introverted. I'm sure if you've lived here for any period of time, you've heard of the Seattle freeze. And that is really a function of the levels of extroversion in the Seattle area, which tend to be lower. Whereas if you were to move to one of these states that had more orange here, then you'd likely find people reaching out to you much more than we do in the Pacific Northwest. You can also see a difference for those of you from California. Southern California tends to be more extroverted, whereas Northern California tends to be more introverted. Just another way for Los Angeles and San Francisco to, be battle with each other, I guess.
Hey, Michael, real quick, we did have an interesting question related to
Okay.
that. Someone's asking, are the data points by self-report, just to add a little context?
Yes. So these data points are done by self-report. I've done some research where we've asked spouses to rate their spouse and find strong correlations between self-reports and spousal ratings. There's also pretty good evidence, like I mentioned, about seeing someone's workspace or observing their behavior, that you can do a good job of assessing their personality if you can observe it over time. And one of the more interesting studies on this was done with zookeepers, where zookeepers were asked to rate the animals in terms of the 5 different personality factors, and found that there was pretty good inter-rater reliability between different zookeepers assessing the traits of different animals, including things like turtles.
Oh, interesting.
So
Thanks for sharing.
Whereas these are self-report results, they are pretty consistent with other reports, as long as you can observe someone's behavior over a long period of time. Okay, good. So Terry, yes, let me just address this at this point. And indeed, like the Myers-Briggs type inventory tends to talk about this kind of energy level, and there does seem to be evidence for this, although it's not discussed as much within the big 5. Whereas extroverts get energy from being with other people, introverts get energy from being alone. The neuroscience behind this suggests that people who are introverted are more internally stimulated. And so when they are in a crowd, then they tend to become overstimulated because they are at a baseline level of stimulation that is higher than people who are extroverted. Whereas extroverted people need the stimulation from others, introverted people do not. So there's, I think there is some evidence for it, but not that it's the energy we get is not part of the definition, but rather kind of a an outcome of the trait. The A in the ocean mnemonic is agreeableness. And so it's the extent to which you tend to be warm, kind, cooperative, sympathetic, helpful, and courteous. We tend to really like people who are high in agreeableness because we like people who embody these sorts of traits. And whereas extroverts tend to prioritize status striving and conscientious people tend to prioritize achievement striving, highly agreeable people prioritize communion striving. They want to have a good sense of being connected with others and security in those relationships. They have a strong desire to be accepted by others in personal relationships. And often what you'll find for people who are highly agreeable in a work team is that they will be the people who will be concerned about how everyone is getting along and wanting to make sure that the emotional tone of the group is fine and that we can all work well together. Whereas people who are low in agreeableness don't care so much about how people get along. And in fact, because of that, often people who are lower in agreeableness are not well liked by others because they might constantly challenge what other people are thinking. They're not afraid to disagree. And sometimes they disagree in a not so nice way. The higher someone is in agreeableness, the more they engage in the set of behaviors that we refer to as organizational citizenship behaviors. These are being a good citizen in your team, in your organization. And so people who are high in agreeableness tend to do these sorts of things. They'll help out coworkers more often. They'll share information with them. They'll go above and beyond. They'll speak well of the organization outside of work. But on the other hand, people who are low in agreeableness tend to be more proactive. So if they see something that's wrong, they will likely speak up and perhaps take action on it. And so we do need disagreeable people. And the place where we need them in particular is when we are making decisions. If we have a team that is going to make a decision and it's full of highly agreeable people, then likely you won't have as much dissent as you would need in order to be able to come to the best conclusion. People would just be more concerned about maintaining harmony or Mark, groupthink can happen when there are these pressures for conformity, and agreeable people tend to put that pressure on themselves, to get along with the group. So this is some research that I've done. That's my name on this particular meta-analysis. And so people who are high in agreeableness definitely engage in this kind of interpersonal citizenship behavior more so than people who are low in agreeableness. Okay, here's the distribution of agreeableness. And again, we see a big clustering in the southeast of the country. I think of this as Southern hospitality, the idea that you're going to kind of care and take care of people. Although I have a student from the South who said, yeah, we do this, but it's just on the outside. And when we that what we're really feeling sometimes comes out as bless your heart to someone else when bless your heart is not a positive thing to have said to you in the South. But also we see some of this in the upper Midwest, a much higher in agreeableness throughout Minnesota and the Dakotas and throughout the southern part of Texas. So this is one where I'm kind of in the middle, and I think the scores here from my home are kind of in the middle. And so, yeah, Southern politeness all fake. Yes, indeed. I've also had a student last year who said the distinction between the West Coast and the East Coast is that on the West Coast, we're nice, but not kind. And on the East Coast, they're kind, but not nice. And that, there may be some validity to that too. I don't know, there's no research on that, but I think it's kind of a nice way to think about it. So Nora, age differences. I'm not going to talk about age differences, but in the presentation, but we can talk about that during the Q&A at the end, because there are some trends over a lifespan of how these personality traits change. They're not strong, but they are real. The N, the final one in the five-factor model, is neuroticism. And so this captures the extent to which people tend to be nervous, moody, emotional, insecure, jealous. I want to be clear here, we're not talking about neurotic disease, like a mental illness, but rather this is someone who is mentally healthy can be high on this particular trait. Now, because the term neuroticism is sometimes not well accepted, like I don't want to be told that I'm highly neurotic. Some organizational psychologists prefer to use the term emotional stability. And so these are reversed. So if you're high in neuroticism, that means low in emotional stability. Low in neuroticism means high in emotional stability. To be honest, I don't think that's much better because, you know, if I'm told I'm highly neurotic or I'm not emotionally stable, both of those seem equally bad to me. But so we're going to stick with talking about neuroticism, but Sam Gosling in the geographic chart refers to as emotional stability. Neuroticism is associated with stress in two different ways. That people who are high in neuroticism tend to interpret or appraise day-to-day situations as more stressful than people who are low in neuroticism. So this is differential exposure to stressors. With the same stressor, someone who is higher in neuroticism would interpret that as more stressful. But also there's differential reactivity to stressors. So people who are high in neuroticism tend to feel like they're less able to cope with the stressors that they face in everyday life. Whereas people who are low in neuroticism may feel like, yes, you know, if it is a highly stressful situation, they may interpret it, you know, as being stressful, but they would perceive themselves as having better emotional resources to be able to cope with that stress. And in fact, in my dissertation work, I looked at this. And so if you've ever hired someone new and then you face the decision, well, how do I bring this person on? Do I throw a lot of work at them, kind of throw them in the deep end with work, and then they'll pick up the job fast? Or do I let them go in the shallow end of the pool and just give them a little bit of work? And so my dissertation found that for people, it depends on the level of neuroticism of your new hire. So people who are high in neuroticism, you want to let them go in the shallow end of the pool, because if they go in the deep end and they're overwhelmed with work, they don't learn anything from it. They just become overwhelmed by the stress of the workload. Whereas for people who are low in neuroticism, you can throw them in the deep end and they can kind of handle all of that stress that's coming at them, and they end up actually learning more about the job from having that higher workload. Here's the circumflex of emotions again. And so as we saw with extroverts, they tend to be in the upper right quadrant of the circumflex. For people who are high in neuroticism, they tend to be in the upper left quadrant here. So people who are high in neuroticism tend to spend more of their lives experiencing emotions that are the ones up there. So being tense, being frustrated, being distressed, annoyed. People who are high in neuroticism and low in agreeableness are often the most challenging people to get along with interpersonally, because they're low in agreeableness. They're willing to kind of not have good relationships with other people, and they're high in neuroticism, so they're experiencing a lot of these kinds of emotions, and so that can be a very challenging experience. For those who are low in neuroticism or more emotionally stable, they're not in the bottom right, but rather they tend to experience a more broad range of emotions on a day-to-day basis. And here's our final geographic distribution. And note here that this says emotional stability. So in this case, orange means lower levels of neuroticism, and blue means higher levels of neuroticism. So the Northeast, highly neurotic place in general, whereas a lot of the rest of the country, we see quite a bit of distribution, much less in the South, The West Coast tends to be a little bit lower in neuroticism. I think it's funny, like, Los Angeles, Southern California, extroverted, highly open. They'll try anything with other people and they won't care so much about it. We have other places on the East that are higher in neuroticism, but also high in openness. And so they'll try a lot of different things, but they'll feel stressed out about it afterwards. All right, so what does this mean for you in terms of how you get along with other people and what you need, ways that you could approach overcoming some of the challenges of your natural personality? Now, as I mentioned, personality gives us a range of behaviors. And so often what we need to do is stretch that range and work more into the other areas. So for neuroticism, if you're high in neuroticism, you might be perceived as too fiery. And so that might make you short-tempered and liable to overreact. And so what you want to do here is kind of verbalize your emotions, understand what you're feeling, find some way to get the anger out before you interact with other people. If you're low in neuroticism, you might be perceived as being too composed. And people you work with might think you're too laid back, or you're over-optimistic. And so here, one of the recommendations we have is to create kind of a mental spreadsheet. Like, what are the negatives as well as the positives? Because if you're low in neuroticism, you think, oh, I'm not so worried about things. But now you can kind of focus a little bit more on what the negatives might be. And that would help you understand kind of the stress that someone who's higher in neuroticism might be feeling. For extroversion, if you're high in it, you're generally going to be well accepted in American society, but you can also be perceived as both too assertive and too energetic. And so you might be domineering and kind of crushing a debate between people at work or with a spouse or partner. And so what you want to do here is kind of, follow something like the 4-sentence rule. I'm going to say 4 sentences and no more. I'm not going to dominate this conversation, and I'm going to listen and show people that I've listened. If you're high in extroversion, then this can be wearing for people who are trying to keep up. And so you want to maybe reassure them. You don't have to continue at this pace. And don't assume people who are a little slower are slow-minded, but rather they're just taking things at their more natural pace. If you're low in extroversion, though, you can be too introspective. And so socializing can be painful. And often you might have a serious facial expression, which is often referred to as RBF. Have you heard this before? Excuse my French, but resting bitch face. Often this is more for introverted people than extroverted people. With extroverted people, as I said, slap the smile off your face. But, for those of us who are introverts, we can kind of have this more serious expression. So create timeouts for yourself to recharge. Whenever I teach 3-hour-long classes. After class, I will go back to my office, I'll close the door, and I'll just sit and be by myself for an hour to allow myself to recharge. And you can find something that reminds you to relax your face. So if you've got something that where you're in a meeting, you can have a little fidget toy or something else that'd be like every time you look at it or feel it, you're like, oh, that's right. I need to not look quite so serious. For openness to experience, so openness is good for artistic and scientific fields, but you can be too innovative. And so if you're high in openness to experience, this can be unsettling for people who are more conventional, particularly if you're chasing the next shiny object or the next new idea. And so maybe you need someone who's going to kind of keep you more grounded and regulate these bouts of creativity so that you're not always introducing new things. This is a problem I had when I was working in a nonprofit, and I constantly wanted to change things. I had many staff who were lower in openness, and they're like, we just changed this last month. Why are we changing it again? And so we need a little bit more stability. You can also be too complex if you're high in openness to experience. So you might lose people by talking too much in the abstract. And so you want to kind of focus, highlight what are the critical objectives you're trying to achieve, and start from the problem to the context, not vice versa, meaning you're not going to say, here are all the things that I'm thinking about, but rather focus on what the real problem is that you're trying to solve. However, if you're low in openness to experience, you can be avoidant of risk and uncertainty and unwilling to experiment. And so here the stretching is to challenge yourself. to try something new. Try a different food, kind of cuisine of food than you've had before. Try different behaviors than you have before. Do something each day that scares you, kind of takes you out of your comfort zone, can help you stretch. For agreeableness, as I mentioned, being high in agreeableness, people tend to like you a lot, but you can be too considerate and you can be perceived as being naive or easy to manipulate. And so you want to change your mindset here from I want to be liked to I want to be perceived as fair, or perhaps I want to be admired more than liked. If you're low in agreeableness, we have 3 suggestions here because this is the one that's the most challenging. You can be perceived as too competitive, too watchful, too rational. And so you want to kind of focus on, what's in it for others. So as you're disagreeing, you're saying, here's why I'm disagreeing, and here's why this can be beneficial. You can share, you can self-disclose about yourself to kind of get people to connect with you more, and use self-deprecating humor. You can focus on, this is the role I'm playing, which requires me to kind of challenge or push back a little bit. And remember that the packaging is part of the message, that you don't have to disagree in a rude way. You can disagree in a much more tactful way. And so to focus much more on this kind of tactful communication. With conscientiousness, finally, then, if you're high in this, that's generally really good, but you can be too thorough. If you're a leader, a manager who is high in conscientiousness, then you might have a tendency to micromanage. I had a manager like this early in my nonprofit career who assigned a task to me for a large convention that we were putting on in Washington, D.C. And then I was working on it. The next day he said, here's what I think we should do about that task that I've delegated to you. And it was completely demotivating to me because now I feel like he's intervening too much. And so if this is you, then you want to focus more on coaching and asking questions and maybe leading people, not in a more directive way, but in an indirect way to the kind of things that you're thinking, and invite them to challenge you. Similarly, with conscientiousness, a big problem with conscientiousness, people who are high in conscientiousness tend to get burnt out more than people who are low in conscientiousness. So you really need to be careful about taking care of your well-being and switching off your work mode. My time is expandable. Don't do that, but rather, this is the time I'm working, this is the time I'm not working. Use that time you're not working to recover. If you're low in conscientiousness, however, you might be too decisive or too quick to make a decision, is really what this means. So you might be too trusting of your intuition. And so there you need to slow down your decision making and say, what do the data say? And maybe, sleep on it. This was something I learned as a manager in a nonprofit. A staff member would come to me with an idea, and one particular who was very high on openness would come to me with lots of ideas, and I love talking about them with her. But then I would say, let's let it germinate. Let's think about it for a little while and not jump to implementing it right away. And then often we would find that as we thought about it more, as time went by and we got more information, we saw this maybe wasn't as good of an idea as we originally thought. So if you're someone who's lower in conscientiousness, and you might just kind of want to slow down, you might appoint a devil's advocate. If you have someone who's low in agreeableness in your team, then they're likely going to be playing that devil's advocate role all the time. I find that it's really beneficial to appoint a devil's advocate, and that way you give someone the freedom to be able to disagree. So that's something you can do particularly if you're low in conscientiousness. Now, finally, what I want to share with you is if you are in a leadership position, or if you're considering whether a leadership position is good for you, that we have updated meta-analytic evidence from last September. And this suggests that there are small correlations between these different personality traits and the extent to which people tend to emerge as leaders. So leadership emergence is the extent to which you tend to be tapped to be a leader of a situation. It varies in terms of how effective leaders are perceived to be. And this is measured by the people that are the followers of the person in that leadership position, so the subordinates of the manager, rate how effective they are as leaders. And then also in terms of their unit performance. Any guesses as to who gets tapped to be leaders the most out of all these 5 traits? You can type in the chat if you have a guess. See a lot of extroversion coming in. You're darn right there. Yeah. So extroversion is the highest. So if you don't know statistics, correlations vary from -1 to 1. If it's a positive correlation, means more of this trait means you tend to emerge more as a leader. So neuroticism is the only negative one. People who are high in neuroticism tend to emerge less as leaders than people who are lower in neuroticism. We see this also to some extent with openness and conscientiousness tend to be tapped a little more. How about in terms of effectiveness? Who's perceived as being effective as leaders? Do you have any guesses there? Agreeableness, we have a guess there. Extroversion, conscientiousness, openness. All right, for those of you who guessed openness, it is the most, but not by a lot. And these are pretty small correlations. I think the good news about this is that your ability to be an effective leader is not determined by your personality. This is really evidence that leaders are made, not born. That you can have a variety of different personality traits and still be perceived to be effective as a leader. You may have a head start if you're higher in extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and lower in neuroticism, but there's a lot of variance that is not explained by these traits. Unit performance, any guesses on who's the best, which trait is most relevant for that one? Conscientiousness, got a lot of guesses for conscientiousness. Agreeableness. Okay, no one's right. It's actually openness to experience tends to have the highest correlation with unit performance. I think that's because leaders who are highly open to experience are willing to consider different ways of approaching the task. And often they can lead their team to try a new way that ends up being more effective. Whereas people who are low in openness to experience tend not to find that quite as much. Conscientious, yes, indeed, it still matters. I think what's really interesting to me about this chart is the comparing of extroversion and openness. That extroverts tend to be tapped as leaders twice as much as they're effective as leaders. For openness, they tend to be more effective or have better unit performance than they're actually tapped to be as leaders. So what I'd like you to take out of this is that while there may be some traits that give you a range of behaviors that may make you more or less likely to be effective or to emerge as a leader, there's a lot of room to move, and you can consciously work on changing those parts of your personality that maybe aren't as effective, but it requires conscious, concerted effort to do so. I tend to be one of those people who's lower in agreeableness, and so I make one New Year's resolution every year, and it's to be warm. And I think I've been able to change my personality over the last 15 years as I focused on trying to be a warmer person. And we can all do that. Of whatever trait you have that might be a challenge, find some ways that you can focus concerted effort to behave in ways that are different, to stretch your behaviors so that you can expand that range and maybe move your personality in the direction where you want it to go. So for those of you who haven't taken the assessment, there is one here. If you are interested in getting a personal development report, I have a paid assessment. It costs $45 for University of Washington employees, but you can feel free to reach out to me if you want to do that. I'm not trying to shill for it. It's just something I do for in some consulting work. But I can give you an 11-page kind of personal report that's going to be maybe not as nice as the report you get from this website because it's taking things a lot more seriously. I also recommend these 2 books by Brian Little in particular. This is an excellent book on the 5-factor model and how you can adjust or change your personality. And for those of you like me who are on the introverted side of the spectrum, I found Susan Cain's book Quiet to be very therapeutic. And so if you're on that side, I would recommend that. If you're an extrovert and you don't understand your introverted partner or coworker, that might be a good recommendation for you as well. Okay, we have a few minutes left to take questions. So
Yeah,
Anna, do you
Michael,
want
I've been
to
keeping an
focus us
eye on
there?
that chat. Yeah, we've had so many thoughts coming through. I know so many of you had some questions about the data and correlations. We probably won't have time to go into all of those. There's a lot of questions about, which traits connect and whatnot. But Michael, can you just speak a little bit to, is there a seen correlation between the traits and then also any impact with gender?
Yeah, so the correlation, the four traits that we saw, the positive correlations with leadership, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness have small to moderate positive correlations with each other. And they all have small to moderate negative correlations with neuroticism. So if you're high on one, you tend to be higher on some of these others. And this is why I think that this is not the perfect tool, because we're not really distinguishing between all these traits perfectly using the tools that we have. In terms of gender, women on average tend to be higher in neuroticism than men are. And I've thought about this a lot. And what I think is that women just actually perceive the world more accurately than men do, because men have been in positions of kind of power for a long time that they don't perceive things as stressful. But I think women tend to perceive the world a little bit more accurately. So that's the only really significant gender difference on these traits. Oh, the lifespan one. So yes, we find that people tend to become a little less open as they age. So think back to like if you went to college, the kind of things you were trying in college versus the kinds of things you're trying now, maybe your openness has decreased a little bit. People tend to become less extroverted as they over the lifespan, and less neurotic over the lifespan. So this explains why people who, the neurotic one, why people who are older tend to be happier than people who are younger, because they're kind of lowering their levels of neuroticism compared to where they were before.
We had another, question come in asking about how do these personality types present differently across kind of the neurodivergent range? Is that something you can speak to?
Sorry, across what range?
Across neurodivergence and folks
Oh,
who are
yes.
neurotypical versus neurodivergent?
Great question. I have been diagnosed on the autism spectrum myself, and there has not, as far as I know, been really rigorous research in this area. There does tend to be, appear to be anecdotally a correlation between being on the autism spectrum and introversion. Although there are autistic extroverts, so it's not a perfect correlation, but it tends to be there. And for people, my guess would be for people with ADHD, they tend to be people who are higher in openness to experience, because they're willing to think about a lot of different things. But that's just my hypothesis at this point, and I don't know of any rigorous research done in that area.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We are at time. So much kudos in the chat. I would just want to echo that. This was so insightful. I know there are some questions that came in around, tips for working with colleagues who are high or low in certain areas. And I'm sure those slides we went through at the end will be super helpful with that. Just want to reiterate for everyone, we will be sending out a PDF of these slides. And this talk has also been recorded, so it'll go on YouTube. But with that, Michael, we just really appreciate your time. This is so interesting, and there's so many insights that we can take for our own, personal growth, but then also for our effectiveness in teams. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I've put my email address in the chat in case anyone wants to contact me with other questions you have that weren't addressed, or if you want that more extensive assessment, we could do that as well.
All right. Well, have a great
Thanks,
afternoon.
everybody. I hope that that this was helpful and that you can stretch your personality in ways that will be effective for you.
Bye now.
All right, I have a, well, I'm just going to look at this for people who are still in the room. NV asked a direct message question on could seemingly contradictory personality traits derive from the whole opposites attract adage in one's parents? Actually, the research on opposites attract in romantic relationships finds that it's not generally true, that we do tend to be attracted to people who are more similar to us rather than people who are more different from us. But if you do have people who are very different, my wife is very extroverted, and our kids are kind of a mix between them. And on the subdimensions of extroversion, they tend to score differently, with some of them being kind of high in some dimensions of extroversion and low in the others. Whereas, like my son, whereas my daughter tends to be high and low on different characteristics. So indeed, that can come from our genetics, as well as being raised, with those parents.
This was so interesting, Professor Johnson. I'm so glad that you came and did the talk today. I was watching the
Good.
chat. I can tell everybody else was too.
Yeah, hostility. It's a Peter Vitaliano published a paper with Costa. So Paul Costa is one of the founders of the five-factor model. I'd be really interested in reading that particular study. Huh. Someone asked about the Strengths Finder through Gallup. The problem with the Strengths Finder is that they have not, because it's a proprietary test, they've not made it publicly available to be able to do assessments on. So it's a little harder to determine the psychometric characteristics of it. Same thing about the Enneagram. I would tend to think the Strengths Finder is better than the Enneagram, but that's hypothesis more than based on empirical research.
The other personality tests seem to have some like fun, interesting information that they reveal pretty quickly and presumptively. Like you're supposed
Yes.
to be this in your career, and this is the ways that you act, and you have this title like of your personality type, like the Myers-Briggs.
Yeah. Yeah. Put you in one of those boxes.
People love that. I think they like having that
They do. They do.
prescribed
We
thing.
tend to like categories rather than, being somewhere on a scale. Oh, hey, Peter, correlation was. Is Peter still with us? If so, can you unmute?
I see Peter's still here. I don't know if he's by his computer or not.
Okay.
Oh,
Hi,
yeah.
can
All
you
right.
hear?
So, yeah.
Yeah,
So correlation was 0.4 between what?
between hostility when they were freshmen at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and 24 years later,
Wow.
we did it again, and on the 2,700 students, and the correlation and for the hostility, which is the facet from the neuroticism dimension, was 0.40. So that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Did you see any mean level differences over time?
Um, not significant differences.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's, try to get that kind of correlation over 24 years with the Myers-Briggs type inventory. Definitely not going to happen.
Well, the reason why, to me, that's so important is because the period between when you're 18 and 24 years later, your personality has a much greater opportunity for change because of so many major events that could take place compared
Yes.
to the 24 years from when you're, say, 45 to when you're 70.
Mhm.
So I just think that's amazing. And I also think it's really relevant to thinking about health, because in the work we've done, hostility is probably, I mean, it's really the most important variable for looking at blood pressure and dysregulation of all of your physiological systems, not just the cardiovascular, but also metabolic. Hostility is really related to blood sugar levels.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I can just imagine in the business world how careful you have to be about working with people who are high HO.
Yeah. Yes. I'm looking up my my NEO results to see where I am on hostility.
Oh, I will bet you that you're pretty low. I have been studying this for years, and I really would bet that you're definitely at the 40th percentile or something.
Yeah, I'm even lower than that.
Yeah, see,
I'm at the
35,
31st.
30 what?
31st percentile.
Yeah, see, good for you. That's why you're nice and healthy.
No, but I'm actually just prescribed blood pressure medication.
Yeah, but the thing is, you have to understand that when you reach middle age and you're a male in our society, um, I've just had these fantasies about if I could give the Neo to the people in the White House.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think we could probably assess some of those from their public personas, but that would be interesting.
If anybody's interested in this, I have Neo on 240 couples, older adults, and I'm starting to finally analyze them. I did this with Paul Costa and got the
Very
Neo on people who were married to someone with Alzheimer's disease and taking
good.
care of them, and
Mhm.
then control group. And so I'm just really interested in looking at changes in personality over 2 years in those who have chronic stress.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking my own parents. My dad passed away 2 years ago from Lewy body dementia. And my mom, it was such a struggle for her. And I'm just trying to think about whether I think her personality changed over the 4 years that he was declining.
Yeah,
Really interesting study, Paul, or Peter, sorry. That was
yeah,
something to think about.
yeah.
Peter, if you're ever interested in doing an event with work life for the whole you, we would love to have you.
So this is kind of interesting. I'm in my 49th year in the med school, and I was just talking with our president, who I knew when she was a psych professor, because I'm in the psych department and also in psychiatry, about retiring. So I plan to do some major talks next year. And so I'm preparing a whole bunch of things. And then, especially if I get the personality data together and get some interesting results, I'd love to do that. And I also love to stay in touch with you, Michael.
Absolutely, Peter. Yeah, love that.
Well, Peter, if you don't mind, I'll put you down for 2026 and we'll reach out at the end
Okay.
of this year and see if we can coordinate something. I think if what you're talking about is personality in relationships, especially romantic or coupling, that would fit right into our scope here in work life for sure.
Excellent. Sure. I'd be happy to. Thank you.
No, thank you. We would really, really love that. And Professor Johnson, thank you again so much for everything. I am
Yep.
really hankering to look through those slides and see those charts and be able to actually read them in detail, because those are an amazing asset to take away. So thank you for that. We really
Good.
appreciate
Yeah,
it.
my pleasure.
All right, I'm going to close out the meeting because I do think that this piece will be used for another meeting here coming up shortly. So,
Okay. Thank you,
all right.
Jessica.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you, Anna, if
Alan.
you're still here
All right.
too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.